Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us for Coaching for an Evolving Leadership Landscape, How Effectiveness Has Changed Since 2020. We know your schedules are really busy, and we just so appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. So my name is Lucy Sullivan. I'm going to be your host along with my colleague, Kayla Burnett. And before we get into the heart of the presentation, just a little bit of housekeeping. So we are recording today's webinar. You'll get a link to the recording, the slides. We actually do a blog post with the summary of the key points and the Q&A. You'll get all of that after the webinar. To stay focused during the webinar, most of the time we'll have cameras off. We have the chat closed, but the Q&A is open. And that's where we want to hear from you. And we want to hear from you the whole time. Don't hold back. So you don't need to wait for the Q&A breaks to pop your questions in. Anything you're wondering about, any ideas you have, concepts you want to discuss, please go ahead and throw them in there. We love getting that discussion going. We will stop for Q&A a couple of times. And if we don't get to any of the questions, which is usually the case because there's a lot of great ones, if there are any we don't get to, we actually will follow up afterwards directly, and we'll share those on the blog as well. So there's a lot of cool questions afterwards as well. So just a brief introduction of who MRG is and who's going to be taking you through our content today. MRG, Management Research Group, we're a global leader in designing assessments that impact people in profound and meaningful ways. So we have solutions for leadership, motivation, personal development, sales. You may have tried some of these if you know us. We've been supporting coaches with assessments for 40 years. This year is our 40th year. So we work closely with coaches. We do coaching ourselves. And so we're really close to the process. The assessments are driven by research, which you're going to be hearing about today. And they're designed to foster self-awareness and encourage lasting growth. They've been used by thousands of coaches and certified practitioners in more than 100 countries around the world. And so we're just excited to have you with us. If you don't know us, we hope you get to know us a little better. And our presenters today are Trisha and Maria. So Maria is the head of research at MRG. She has a PhD from Vanderbilt. She's conducted award-winning research on educational practices. She's presented for, you might have seen her at SCP, European Mentoring and Coaching Council, many others. She has just a tireless curiosity and enthusiasm for these research questions and kind of getting to the bottom of what's going on with people. And then we also have Trisha Nadif, who's the president of MRG. She's been working with individuals, teams, and organizations for over 30 years herself in consulting, coaching, product design, the research. She's really got a hand in all of it. She also has presented in many places. You might have seen her at ATD, SCP. She's been a TEDx speaker. She loves to share both experience, the research, the wisdom of MRG. So they're both excited to get started. So I won't talk too much longer and I will let them go to it. And I believe we're starting off with a poll. Yeah.
We are starting off with a poll. Thanks, Lucy. Welcome, everybody. We're glad you can join us. MRG, I think it's fair to say we're obsessed with leadership. And we are always looking at the patterns of how leadership changes, how it evolves. We know there's no one right way to lead, and leadership is dependent on context. It's dependent on what people are trying to accomplish, and it's dependent upon the leader. So, of course, we've just gone through something relatively dramatic as a global population. And so it makes sense to look at now what's happening with leadership. So we'd like to start with a poll and just get your sense from your experience. How do you think leadership effectiveness has changed since 2020, since before the pandemic disrupted everything? So your choices are: overall, in my observation, leaders are becoming more effective. I see some devolving. I see overall there's less effectiveness in a space. And you could say, even though maybe you've noticed some changes, if you're looking through the lens of effectiveness, it's relatively the same. Of course, across our population of people that are joining us, you're seeing all kinds of things. Leaders who are stepping back, leaders who are stepping up. So just give us a sense for, in general, if you were to average out your perceptions. More effective, less effective, maybe different, but roughly the same in terms of effectiveness.
I'm excited to see what people
Me
are
too.
predicting.
Me too.
We've got just about everyone in, so I'm going to go ahead and just give it a moment. Thanks, everyone. And the poll and share the results.
This is the most fun game show. So we have, okay, so overall less effective in terms of little over 57%, and then pretty even split. I'm seeing people more effective, perhaps a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more intentional, and maybe the folks who endorse the last choice, seeing some changes, but not seeing it really a marked difference in effectiveness. It's great. All right. So that's why we're here to do the exploration and see where we are. So this is the journey for today. We're going to talk just quickly about why now. Why did we want to do this deep exploration now? Maria is going to lead us through our research around looking at pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic leadership and really understanding the shifts that have happened. We're going to talk about 4 specific behavior shifts that are important in this particular time in leadership. And we're going to talk about organizational life right now and what, as a population of people who may be internal or external, but somehow have a voice into organizations around how to think about leadership, we're going to touch on 5 shifts that really are important to happen right now. We will stop for Q&A at 2 key points, but as Lucy said, please, please, please keep your questions in the chat, and we will be sure to take care of them. So let's talk about why now? Why, after this kind of whitewater of 3.5 years, why are we looking at things now? So I think that it is an important time to sort of ground our reflections on leadership. Certainly the post-pandemic space that we're in now, the emergency has ended. Of course, COVID cases are up and it will create a little bit of a ripple, but that whole sort of intensity that we went through has passed. We've got a very interesting dynamic as we look at returning back to work. As the news has reported, and I'm sure will continue to report, there's a lot of tussle happening in different places. Coming back to work, staying remote, being hybrid, disagreement, I think, in some cases between what employees want and what employers want. That's going to continue to create some tension and upheaval. And we definitely are seeing continued economic shifts that are impacting us. We've got labor shortages, as we know, as more people left the labor pool. We, of course, have ongoing social justice issues. We are navigating many mental health challenges across a broad swath of populations, where there's environmental concerns. We've got a whole host of things that are creating a level of uncertainty. And of course, nothing is static in environment and organizational life, and certainly in individuals' lives. So we are snapshotting at a moment in time. When we think about what organizations need right now, there are some really significant growing needs that are top of mind. So again, talent shortage. So organizations are reflecting on how do we become an employer of choice? What do we need to do to attract and retain good folks? How do we make sure we keep the folks that we have? Right now, in many places, the commitment to organizational life from the employee perspective is unstable. Engagement scores are coming back lower than pre-pandemic times. So how are we going to keep the people that we do have? How are we going to continue to develop leaders in this post-pandemic uncertain world? How are we going to continue build a better bench strength has long been an issue, but where we've got even more shortfall in talent, how do we really heat up in that space? And we have a pretty dramatic post-pandemic generational shift. Baby boomers, of course, have been leaving organizational life for quite a while now, but through the pandemic and post-pandemic, they are leaving in record numbers. And meanwhile, we have Gen Z entering the workplace at an increasing rate. And some of them, because Gen Zs right now range in age from 14 to 28. So some of the even older Gen Z folks are beginning to enter the leadership ranks. So we know every time there's a generational shift in the workforce, it creates disruption. So we're on the eve of the Gen Z generational disruption. So all of these things that organizations have and have concerned about are more concerning to them right now than financial concerns, particularly since the economic reports that are coming out are, well, not giving us a totally clean runway about the potential for a recession. There are a lot of the financial predictions have backed off of that prediction. Of course, the individual leaders have many needs right now. They are living in this very uncertain world. And what we see in this space is that they want development, and they want development in particular because they know there's a lot riding on their leadership abilities. They know that in organizational life right now, there's a lot of upheaval, and they're not quite sure what effective leadership looks like right now. There is, do I have remote people? Am I in person? Am I hybrid? Is that going to stay the same? What do people need right now? How are people's personal lives affecting their work lives? So there is a lot of uncertainty in how do I map my leadership space right now? And they know that there is, at least in some sectors and in some organizations, there's a crisis of trust, right? So how do they, as leaders, build trust with their lead? But they also want to trust the organization. They want to trust the senior leaders. And this idea of what's important now organizationally, how employee-centric are we going to be, how much are we going to mandate, is creating a question about faith in the organization. Leaders, like all employees right now, want the ability to have a flexible work life that creates balance for them. And according to the studies that we've looked at with Gallup and DDI, these needs are surpassing compensation concerns. Of course, everybody wants to be well compensated, but they want a life and a work world that gives them a sense of satisfaction and a sense of balance with their non-work world. So it's easy for leaders right now to feel lost, and for those of us who are trying to support leaders to wonder, what is our work about right now? And so we want to start by really focusing on how we can think about where leaders are right now and how we might help them move forward in a world that is still shifting and changing. So we'll start with how effective leadership has changed, and Maria's going to take us through that space. She's done some wonderful research that's given some great insight to the question. So Maria, to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Trisha. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And so let me get started. As some of you know, and the rest of you are going to learn today, MRG Insights are evidence-based. We use our global assessment database to answer the questions we are all asking about leadership and motivation and other similar topics like this one. How did the pandemic affect leadership? So let's get to it. Let's get to the research. So the research that we're going to share with you today is based on data collected from the LEA 360, which is a psychometric assessment that measures both behavior and effectiveness separately. And because it's 360, we're looking at it from the perspective of the leader and also bosses, peers, and direct reports. Now, the LEA measures 22 leadership behaviors that tell us what leaders are doing, and they are specific and neutral. The fact that they're specific means that leaders are able to clearly see what they are doing from the perspectives of their own perspective and the perspective of others, but they're also actionable because they are specific, and they describe behaviors that the leaders understand. They know exactly what it is they would need to change in a developmental plan. They're neutral, and that means that no behavior is good and no behavior is bad in nature. It makes feedback easy to accept because it's not a judgment, but it's part of our philosophy that what makes a behavior more or less desirable, or something they might want to use more or less of, depends on context, on their role, on their goals, the organization. A lot of these other factors are going to add that value to the specific behavior, to all 22 behaviors. Now, the LEA also measures 32 leadership competencies, and these allow leaders to see how they are performing in these 32 areas of leadership. They're great for identifying developmental opportunities, areas where they might want to improve. And through our research, like the research we're going to share with you today, what we're able to do is connect these two pieces of information what they do and how they are performing, and identify which behaviors are associated with effectiveness on each of the 32 competencies. So we're able to link those two to add meaning to those competencies and make them actionable. So the first question we wanted to address with this research was that of changes in leadership effectiveness. Are leaders seen as less effective since the pandemic? And you've already had a chance to think about this. We know what most people in attendance here think. And anecdotally, we've heard that a lot, that leaders are perhaps a little less effective now than they were before the pandemic. So let's explore the data. Let's see what the numbers actually say. So to answer this question, we conducted a global study comparing two groups of leaders. They were matched on function, level, gender, region, and generation. And the reason we do this is to ensure that any differences between the groups are due to time period, which is what we're interested in here, and not these other factors that could potentially have an influence. So one group of leaders the first group of leaders was a pre-pandemic group. And this is over 3,000 leaders who took the LEA 360 in 2018 or 2019, so right before the pandemic. And the other group that we compared them to is the post-pandemic group, and it's the same number of leaders, right, because we matched them, who took the LEA 360 in 2022 or 2023. Okay. So we compared them to see whether there are differences between the groups. And specifically, we were interested in, are there differences in effectiveness? Are leaders now less effective than leaders before the pandemic? So are we ready to see the answer? Are leaders today less effective than pre-pandemic leaders? Well, here it is. Today's leaders are actually rated as more effective than leaders before the pandemic on the following measures: ability to work with diverse people, inclusive leadership, and overall effectiveness. And I'll talk about these in more details in a little bit, but I do want to add a little bit of kind of a nuanced way of looking at this. These differences were, of course, statistically significant. The effect sizes were large enough to indicate that there is a difference between the groups. However, in practice, the shift may seem a little more subtle, right? So you're going to see very few people jumping from a 4 to a 6, right, on a 7-point scale, which is how the LEA measures these. But you're likely to encounter folks jumping up a 1/4 of a point, something, a little smaller, but still, quite noticeable. What is exciting and promising about these results is that they are moving in the right direction, right? They're showing greater effectiveness in 3 competencies that are very relevant and important right now. Now, of course, we will continue to look at the data to determine whether this is an actual shift, something that will persist, or if it's a blip in the data and something that will go back to baseline in a few years. And I definitely invite you to join us in that journey because we will be sharing those results as we get them in the coming years. So let's explore these a little further. So the LEA measures ability to work with diverse people from a broad perspective, right? So the questionnaire asks observers to rate leaders at how effective they are at working with people from different backgrounds, different cultures, belief systems, and or lifestyles, right? So it's a pretty broad way of describing diversity. And there are many reasons why leaders have become more effective in this space. We're going to share a few that we're thinking about, a few of our own hypotheses, but I really encourage you to share your own in the Q&A, and we might visit them. We might talk about them today during the Q&A sections. So remote work expanded people's organizational networks, right? There's that possibility that when you're not constricted to working with the people who are physically there with you, you're working with a greater set of people and working with more diversity, which, may just make us better at it as we get more practice. When times are confusing and problems are novel, leaders can't rely on just one perspective, right? And they might want to get insights from others with diverse perspectives, diverse experiences and ideas. It's also possible that focusing on goals would help people work well with everyone, right? They're not worried about who they're working with. We just need to keep this organization open. We just need to keep, our product coming out. They're focusing on the actual end goal of what they're doing, not necessarily who they're working with. And finally, when collaboration becomes essential, as it definitely did during the pandemic, when we're trying to balance all these different things, leaders may simply have to learn to work well with everyone. And that practice can be reinforced by the positive outcomes that's come out of collaborating with larger groups of people and more diverse groups of people. So when we turn to inclusive leadership, the LEA measure has to do with a leader's ability to bring people together and create involvement, respect, and connection for everyone. So that's what this was measuring. And here's some hypotheses for why this might be higher now, why effectiveness may be higher now. There were new concerns and unpredictability, and that can create a situation where more people are invited into the problem solving space, and they might feel more included, right? So you become better at making people feel comfortable coming in, and of course collaborating in those endeavors. People who were not included before may have been included now, especially if they had expertise in areas that may not have been as important before the pandemic. So think, for example, about how quickly we all had to shift to communicating via video calls, right? There were experts in things like this whose input may not have been requested before, or who may have participated in meetings but not felt the need to really be a part of the group because perhaps their expertise wasn't as essential as it was during the pandemic. When everything else is in a constant state of change and uncertainty, leaders may have tried to create some sense of calm by creating environments where people were able to feel connected and respected, right? So create kind of that more soothing space where people could recharge and go back to dealing with the uncertainty that was waiting for them outside. And then finally, another thing that happened during this time period in many parts of the world was a push for DEI and social justice reform. And those programs and ideas could and probably did have an effect on leadership, right? So we may be seeing some of these things in practice in leaders, and observers are noticing it. Now, finally, our research found that leaders are now seen as more effective overall. And this competency asks observers to rate leaders on performance against expectations and total impact in role. So it is a measure of general effectiveness in their role. And leaders could actually be more effective right now. So that's absolutely a possibility. But we should also consider the possibility that leadership requirements may have shifted during the pandemic. And these new set of requirements for effective leadership may be more attainable, making more leaders show up as effective and increasing overall effectiveness across the board. Now, to answer this question of whether the requirements for effective leadership may have shifted during the pandemic, we turn to the question of what it is that effective leaders were doing at each time period. So here's the question we're going to visit next. What are effective leaders doing differently now compared to before the pandemic? So to answer this, we focused on the top 25% in overall leadership effectiveness. And then we matched them again, right, to make sure that differences have to do with time period and nothing else. And then we asked, what are the differences between these two groups? Which behaviors are they emphasizing differently? So do pre-pandemic leaders emphasize certain behaviors more than post-pandemic leaders do? And do post-pandemic leaders do post-pandemic leaders emphasize certain behaviors more than pre-pandemic leaders did, right? So we're looking at differences in emphasis. Let's start by looking at which behaviors pre-pandemic leaders were using more than post-pandemic leaders are using now. So pre-pandemic leaders, there we go, we're placing more emphasis on a forceful and assertive approach to leadership, kind of a more authoritative approach. They push to achieve and set ambitious goals for themselves and for others around them to a greater degree than pandemic leaders are doing now. They spent time being frank and direct and letting people know where they stand in a straightforward way. They place greater emphasis on persuading and winning people over. And they emphasize the practice of being influential, taking command, and using opportunities to be in charge. Okay. So now that we know this about pre-pandemic leaders, let's look at what behaviors post-pandemic leaders are using more than pre-pandemic leaders used. They are deferring to more senior leaders for guidance and relying on their opinion and organizational norms when making decisions and things like that. They spend more time helping others and compromising, sometimes putting their team's interests first. They place more emphasis on seeking out the opinions of others and actually using others' input. And they spend more time planning for the future and thinking about the broad implications of their decisions. Okay. So now that you've seen both of these, you might start to notice some themes in this these lists of behaviors. So the pre-pandemic leader, effective pre-pandemic leader, looked more assertive and results-oriented, whereas the effective post-pandemic leader is more cooperative and connected. It's as if the pre-pandemic leader was saying, "This is the way, let's get it done," and the post-pandemic effective leader is saying, "We're looking forward together." Okay, so two slightly different approaches to leadership. Now, Tricia will dive into how these findings, how to apply these findings and what they mean. But a word of caution before we get to that part. This research doesn't suggest that we tell leaders to mimic the person on the right and erase any similarity to the person on the left. In fact, the behaviors emphasized more by pre-pandemic leaders are still important and necessary in many contexts, right? So what leaders might want to consider to be effective is using them less frequently by turning up the dial on the behaviors emphasized by leaders on the right. Leadership development does not require stopping a behavior altogether, right? It's not a light switch you can turn on or off. Instead, we should think of it as a dial, where how much emphasis we place on a behavior is turned up or down. And when we use a behavior more, we turn that dial up, we naturally have less time to engage in other behaviors. And by turning up that dial on the behaviors associated with effective leadership post-pandemic, we can become more selective about when leaders can become more selective about when they use the behaviors that are less associated with effectiveness post-pandemic, but still be able to use them when they need them. So Tricia will be taking us through a closer look at how to help leaders turn up the dial as needed. But first, let's see if there are any questions.
We have so many great questions. I'm always impressed by our attendees and their thoughtfulness, but I'm extra impressed today. So we'll get to a few, we'll get to many more later, so please do keep them coming. The first one is a clarifying question that I just want to make sure we tackle for people who are maybe less familiar with our research. What specifically do we mean by effectiveness? So when we're saying more effective, less effective, when we're using that, can we just be super crystal clear about what we mean by that, how we define that?
Absolutely, and that is a very important question. So the way that the 32 competencies are measured in the LEA is a 7-point anchored rating scale. And so what we're looking at, what we're looking for here are differences in average scores in these two groups of leaders. So in overall effectiveness, it's an overarching measure of effectiveness. So what is their impact in their role? overall. And with the other ones I described, what we meant by working well with diverse people, and inclusive leadership, but they're specific to those competencies, and it's a 7-point scale that observers respond to.
Great, thank you. So another great and kind of interesting, a little bit provocative question that I liked was, in other sets of data, of course, we are seeing things like quiet quitting, things like, employees being less engaged. So we are seeing, more negative changes in other data. Is it possible that because our data comes from companies that are investing in leadership development, does that kind of to tip the scale in a certain direction? Obviously conjecture, but I just thought it was a really interesting question.
I might make a comment on that. I think we are, one of the things that we've all been talking about internally is how we really are talking about things at a moment in time. And it's almost like organizations are living two kinds of existences, that they are moving forward, like doing the things that doing development, doing coaching, while there is this undercurrent of disruption. And the disruption is not only happening in organizational life, it's happening in people's personal lives, right? People's personal lives haven't really universally settled down to the pre-pandemic patterns that they were before, taking care of family members, navigating through how we're living, navigating through mental health things. So I think our sample is broad enough that I don't, I'd like to think we have this, beautiful sample of idealistic organizations within our leadership sample. I think it's pretty broad, and I think that probably there are plenty of organizations in our sample that have people who are disengaged, but still they're going along the leadership space. So I think back to Maria's point, we're going to keep looking to see if this is just, a moment in time on a way to a different kind of sets of patterns that will settle out, or is this something that might have a little bit more staying power? But I think that's the reason we want to be paying very close attention as practitioners right now, because it is an unstable environment. It's unstable at an organizational level, and it's unstable at the individuals who are participating in organizational life.
Thank you. There's one more clarifier, and man, these are good. So please stay tuned for the video and the next Q&A break, where we'll try to get to a lot more of these, but we'll have more reasons to follow up. Did want to clarify, I've had a couple questions indicating people maybe thinking that this comparison data is the same group of people taking the LEA twice. And I want to make sure that we're clarifying that that's not the case. It's matched groups of totally different participants.
Absolutely, yeah. Not repeated measures, two entirely different groups of leaders.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
And again, if we didn't get to your question, please keep them coming because we will answer all of them, but I want to make sure we get to the rest of the content. We'll do more Q&A and then follow up again afterwards. So I'm going to let Tricia go to it.
All right, here we go. Do more 4. So there were 4 behaviors, as Maria shared with us, that are in play for highly effective leaders now more than they were before. So just as a reminder, we were looking at highly effective leaders in both categories, and the highly effective pattern of behavior has just shifted a bit in a way that's pretty compelling. So for those of you who are on the call and are LEA users, you know where the data came from. So, but just a reminder for those who this may be new information, we look at in the LEA 360 that the data comes from, it is traditional 360 in that we are measuring from the individual leader's perspective, the person or people that are above them that they choose to invite, their peer groups generally at the same level in the organization, and direct report group, sometimes direct report group and indirect report group. So people more junior than they are in the organization. And so we are focusing on this part part. As Maria shared, we have two parts in the assessment, but in this part, it's the behavioral part. And the questionnaire design is such that it really gives us very discrete information. So for those of you who may not have seen our assessments before, we have a very specific way of designing our questionnaires. And we're intentionally placing a little bit more cognitive demand on the people who are completing the questionnaires, because we're asking them to choose in some very specific ways. So for each prompt, they have 3 options of choices. And in making those choices, we ask them to describe what is most like them, or if they're completing the questionnaire as an observer, what is most like the person that they are assessing. And they have to qualify their first choice. 5 is a strong first choice. 4 is the best first choice out of the options that I have. Then they need to make a second choice. What's the second choice in the triad? Again, qualify that choice. 3, strong second choice. 2, best of the second options that I have available to me. So we're really trying to get very, very specific data that allows us, not only when we're giving feedback, to really have strong, discrete pieces of information to share with individuals, but it allows Maria to do some really exceptional work for us. So let's do a little bit deeper dive. You're going to get, Lucy has created a really great package for you. So please don't worry about frantically writing notes or anything or doing screen captures. You're going to get everything. The first one has been really started to change through the pandemic of this increased deference to authority. And it's a natural occurrence in organizational life when things become uncertain. When things are stable, we understand purpose, we have clear strategic goals, and the environment we're in, both contextually internal to the organization and external to the organization, has a reasonable level of stability, then we can more easily make decisions in the smaller sectors within the organization. But as things change, as things become uncertain, as things are moving around, then highly effective leaders become more attentive to what's happening above them, right? And so that's what's happening here in this deference to authority. It is more attention paid to what is going on above me. What is really interesting about all 4 of these behaviors are these are behaviors that we would call slow down behaviors. What do I mean by slow down behaviors? They are behaviors that require you to take a break from just moving forward on your own steam and taking a pause to either to gather information or reflect on information. So the first slow down is check what's happening above you in the organization to make sure there's alignment as things are changing, to make sure you are at least getting an understanding of which way the wind is blowing. A second level of slowdown is cooperation, which is really stopping you to help others, to be accommodating, to compromise, to really be very holistic in the way you're thinking about the team. So there's an aspect of leadership sometimes that sort of take the hill, forge forward, don't let any obstacles stop you in your way. This is another way, though, of pulling back and slowing down and opening up the space so that there is an aspect of leadership that is taking care of others and taking care of the team holistically. Another aspect of this group of 4 that opens up the space relative to inclusion is consensual. And that is, in our measure, really making sure you're gathering input from other people and letting it influence your thinking. So once again, not just going forward on your own insights, your own level of information gathering, but instead really opening up the space for a more inclusive way of taking in information, taking in ideas, having somebody else flag a potential risk, right? And really letting that influence, as a leader, letting it influence your thinking. Again, it slows down the process. Hopefully with something like consensual, it slows down at the beginning so that you can speed up later on so that you have really anticipated things in a more holistic way. But it's inception and it's the beginning of the space. It is a pause to take in more input. And then finally, strategic is a slow down space because you're projecting into the future, right? You're taking into account where I think we want to go. And I think that is, I think in many cases, these other three behaviors, being attentive to those above you in the organization and what the organization sort of vibe is, being attentive to the well-being and other people's needs in the form of cooperation, slowing down to gather input, actually are all in service of where are we going, and how certain are we of that, and how do we organize ourselves to move forward in this way, and how do we keep assessing the potential implications when the map forward is potentially not so clear. So while the first three are very slow down relative to relationships, this is slow down relative to thinking. It's a more of a cognitive slowdown to really think things through a little bit more comprehensively. So it's an interesting time for us, for those of us who are in a space to pay attention to leadership. I think my colleagues know that I've gotten a little bit of it on a soapbox about this. My soapbox a few years ago was really a soapbox about shared leadership, that we've been asking too much of leaders for the last decade, and it's time to stop thinking about it so singularly. My new soapbox is called Stop the Madness. And I think those of us who are in supporting leaders and supporting organizations, whether we're inside or external, really have an opportunity to influence organizational mindset and leadership mindset in a particular way right now. You know, for those of us who've been in this leadership gig for a long time, we know there have been many times along the way where our work has been to help leaders be more daring, to be more expansive, to be more innovative, to be braver, to be more courageous, to take some risks. But there are also times when our work is to help leaders be more grounded, to be more focused, to really take their finite amount of leadership energy and place it in the right place, where we are probably in these times are helping leaders have good personal practices to be grounded, to be centered, to be stable for the people around them. And we believe right now this is where we are. We're at a time where our work is to help leaders and to help organizations understand that in order for us to have strong ways forward, in order for us to navigate this time where there's still people who are disenfranchised, where there's still uncertainty, where we need to reestablish focus, this is the work that I believe that we're in. So there are 5 things that we would say is our responsibility to at least try to influence organizations in support of leaders. I get so frustrated that, you know, we just constantly heap more onto the leaders. We've told them they need to be good coaches, to be innovative, to do more with less. We've told them to build employee engagement, to be agile, to be good digital leaders, to be mindful leaders. We now want them to be AI savvy, and we want them to calm these employees who are overwhelmed. We want them to work in a way that will keep these employees from being disenfranchised. And it's all under the umbrella of we're under-resourced right now. We need to stop. And I think our work is really helping leaders focus on the priorities that are important now and helping them have appropriate filters to what can be an overwhelming set of expectations so that they can begin to understand what is the best way forward for them without getting overwhelmed. Right now, we are seeing organizations be a little bit all over the map about what is expected and what's happening, right? So we went through a whole phase of danger, danger, the recession is coming. We've had a lot of talk around the shortfall in labor. We have had, yes, we're going to be flexible, work from home. No, we're going to be hybrid. No, we want you back in. No, it's employee choice. No, your job is at stake. Yes, we are okay to spend. No, we want to keep our cash. And so leaders are trying to understand the rules of the game. And so we need to help leaders create a greater level of stability and certainty. And that has to start with the leader first. So what are we doing in coaching leaders for their own personal practices, both internal practices of well-being, as well as how their professional practices that keep them at a level of stability and certainty, so they can in turn help their teams feel a level of stability and certainty. You know, I've been on this soapbox for a long time. We have to be really careful about what we're promoting in terms of what leadership looks like in our organizations. We've got to try to put the brakes on these extensive competency models where we're asking leaders to be all things to all people all the time. We see competency models all the time, and so many of them you could put leap tall buildings in a single bound at the end and it would feel congruent with everything that's on there. Instead, what we really need to do is use our diagnostic tools to help individual leaders understand where they are now and where they need to go from here. Again, diagnostic tools, both in terms of assessments as well as your own diagnostic skills as a coach, really can help leaders see, where am I now? Where am I now from an internal perspective? Where am I now from how I'm showing up as a leader? And how do I move forward in the best way possible, in a way that's sustainable, in a way that takes into account what my finite level of energy, as any human's finite level of energy, can actually bring to bear. We need to stop perpetuating the myth of the single heroic leaders. You know, starting in the 70s, we really started building a mandate for leaders that became increasingly out of control. And it is true that many things are needed of leadership as work becomes more complicated, as societies become more complicated, as we are working with more diverse sets of human beings, which adds to the complexity as it adds to the richness. But we need to stop talking about leadership as if it is the same as leader. We need to create a culture of shared leadership and understand that what we're trying to cover in the realm of leadership is not the purview of any single leader. It is what we are trying to do together, so that we can really start to look at ways of developing individual leaders so that they can bring the best of what they can under the umbrella of leadership, but they see themselves as partners across the employee population and across the leadership population of, let's do this together, let's accomplish this together. And finally, you know, there are so many studies out there now, and we read them all, and so many are done by organizations that we really respect and admire. CCL, DDI, Gallup. There's just a lot of really good work out there. However, the complaint that we have is those of us in the leadership industry, we need to be really careful about not being too cavalier about what is the leader's responsibility. We need to be careful that every employee need and every organizational need is, the solution can't be just the leader, right? The leader is not a different kind of human being. The leader is experiencing all the frustration, the overwhelm, the stress, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, the question about loyalty that every other employee is facing. And so it can't be that whatever ill or whatever opportunity we see in the organization, the answer is the leader will do it. So we need to help the senior leaders who are choosing what organizations are focusing on, to the extent we are able, be choosing a reasonable set of organizational scope, a reasonable set of priorities, that they're narrowing down who we want to be as an organization in terms of values rather than competencies, so that we have a smaller number of things that we can be brilliantly successful at, rather than too many things that we don't have a prayer of actually achieving well. So we're going to open up the space again.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for these terrific questions. A few great ones to get us started. So what are we finding as far as, you talked about behaviors, you talked about effectiveness. Are we finding that leaders are self-aware of this of their own, behaviors and the way they're showing up?
I think, well, of course it varies, right? But what I think we're seeing in practice, because we are also practicing coaches as well as people who are totally nerds about the research, is that people are living questions, I think, more significantly than they were in a pre-pandemic world. Do I want to do this work? What do I really care about in terms of leadership? How am I crafting my own path forward? What feels worth it to me and what doesn't? We've been working in the space of shared leadership for a long time. So I do see more people finding it a little bit more natural to ask, how can I distribute leadership a little bit more across my team? But I think that we are in for probably another 2 years of this. Where am I? What do I want to do? How do I want to participate? So I think there is self-awareness in terms of the questions. I think it's hard to be self-aware in terms of how I am perceived by others right now, when everything is sort of unstable and there's so much uncertainty.
So and I will add, Trisha, and Lucy. So we actually measure self-awareness in the LEA. It's one of the competencies, and it hasn't changed. It's not one of the competencies where leaders are seen as more or less effective. And one thing that we've noticed a lot is it takes time for observers to notice these things. So if self-awareness is increasing and people are, as Trisha mentioned, asking all these questions, we're probably going to see that change reflected in the numbers in a year or two, right? Which is why this is an ongoing process and we're going to continue looking at it. But at the moment, they're still not, it's not detecting it. The data isn't detecting it yet.
I'm going to kind of blend this into two because I think these are sort of related, but a couple great questions coming in. This really looks, we're asking for like a big mindset shift at like the top of the organization. And at the end of the day, many of the folks here are coaching individual leaders. How do we connect that? How do we tie that together? What we're doing as coaches and how we kind of influence that mindset shift.
Yeah, that's a great combo. I do think that a big part of what we need to do now is teach people or encourage people to use their own personal grounding practices, whether it's meditation or exercise or, taking appropriate breaks or I think it is very hard for the individual to navigate the dichotomy between what it feels like to work in the middle of the organization and how little control they have over what's happening at the top of the organization. So I do think it's really important for us as coaches to be helping people with whatever practices help ground them. The second thing I would say is I think we have to also challenge the leaders we're coaching not to use the excuse of, I don't have any control. They don't probably have as much control as they'd like about how much gets pushed down and how ambitious the goals are, but they usually have more control than they think they do over how they prioritize the work, what the standards are of accomplishment, how they keep their own team grounded so it feels less frantic to do the work. So I think that we have more control over helping them in the interior world, but we do still have some ability to help them see the level of control that they have to maintain. I will also say we have been doing this for eons, right? Helping them kind of manage up and do what they can to voice what the implications are of a too chaotic space dribbling down. So not perfect, but that's why they need us.
So jumping back toward this research, we had quite a few questions about, what did we see in different regions? What did we see in different industries when you break that down? And Maria, I know you conducted a lot of that. I'm not asking you to kind of recite it off the top of your head. We focused on one message today, but do you want to comment a little bit on kind of what else is out there for findings?
Yeah, absolutely. So oh my gosh, we took a very broad approach, and then we had to narrow down because we only had an hour, and we wanted to make sure we got the kind of the general message out there today, right? Like overall, what's changing in leadership. And so this sample of leaders is global, all levels, all industries, all functions. It's about 40% female. So it's, it's everyone in the database who took the assessment during that time. And then we matched them, right? So we could get those general findings. But we did look at specific industries and some functions. And there are some differences in those, but they kind of stick to the general one. There are going to be a few additional, maybe a few that behaviors, a few that drop, but we're happy to share that with you. If you have a specific question about an industry, contact us, because we will share with you what research we have. If you're interested in how females or males or people in a particular region shifted their leadership, we've probably looked at it, and we are happy to share it with you.
Probably definitely looked at it.
Yes. And I rolled my eyes, but it's a positive rolling of the eyes. We're very thorough in our research.
Very, very curious. And thankfully, Maria is very, very curious, but also very tolerant of her colleagues' curiosity.
I would say keep an eye on, your inbox, your feed as well. Follow us on LinkedIn if you don't, because we share a lot of interesting little nuggets there that I get Maria to give me and push out there. So keep an eye on us there. I think we have more webinars on us in this topic. We have more resources. So there is a lot more to this. So ask directly, certainly, if you have a question, or keep us in mind. And as I said before, if you saw it in the chat, if you're like the LEA what now, or you want to know more about it, you want to try the assessment, just pop LEA in the Q&A is all you need to say, and we'll make sure that someone follows up with you to get you a little more information and context around that, because I know it's new to a lot of folks who are with us today, which is great. So yes, keep an eye on your inbox. We do a blog with a big wrap up where we'll address a lot of these really wonderful questions that have come in. So those will be there. We'll follow up with you directly as well if you asked a question. Bonus resources, coaching suggestions for those Do More For. We have a great little kit on those, but that's just the beginning. Actually, a lot of other topics came up that triggered some things that we have. I'm going to send everything that's relevant, the research from early in the presentation, those sources for those studies, a few things folks have asked for in the chat. Anyway, it's going to be a great collection of bonus material. So make sure you keep an eye on your inbox for all of that. I did put the SHRM activity code in the chat. I also put a link to our next webinar. So please go ahead and register for that. It's Coaching from the Inside Out with our colleague Drew, a really fascinating one on motivation and a lot of fun. We do have certifications coming up through the end of the year. 2024 dates are coming really soon. And then there's a lot on MRG.com in our research library. You're welcome to hop over there for downloads. If you're already an MRG partner, the knowledge base has just about everything, a whole lot of research, a lot of best practice reports, just about anything you can imagine. So if you are an MRG partner and you're not using that yet, definitely recommend checking it out. The bonus materials you get today will bring you over there so you can start browsing around. Everyone, I think that's all we have, other than just our thanks and gratitude for joining us and your really active participation. I've never seen a Q&A quite like this. Really great discussion coming. So terrific. I think that's all we have. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.